Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining us here at Rule Your Mind. I'm excited to have a good friend of mine and a colleague, Dr. Arlene Bauer. She's somebody I've worked with for quite a long time. She's a certified mental performance coach, recently received her doctorate, and amongst other things, I can't wait to get talking to her about all things performance and sports psychology. Thanks for joining us. Hey, Arlene,
Hey,
how are you
Robert.
doing?
I'm doing well. How
Yeah,
are you doing today?
good, good. Thanks for asking. Um, so yeah, I guess start off. Tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got into this field and kind of a little bit of what you're doing right now.
Okay, yeah. A little bit myself. Thank you for the introduction. Also, I am currently a homeschool teacher, as many other
Yeah,
people. I'm going to add that to my resume. I don't
yeah,
know what my references will be like for
yeah,
that. We'll see at the end of the year.
yeah, exactly. Yeah,
Yeah, so just doing work with the military, working with athletes and people in the business world, and then just some projects on the side. My sister and I are working on a children's book, just combining some of our favorite things, a little bit of
nice.
performance psychology with her
Yeah,
artistry. So that's something we're doing right now. How I got into this, I
yeah,
feel like that's a long story. In college,
yeah,
I started
yeah.
out
Let's hear
as
it.
an athlete. Okay. I started out as an athletic training major in college, and I took sports psychology as an elective, and it really amazed me. I was kind of someone who suffered from performance anxiety, and probably looking back now, I didn't have a
Right.
term for it, but a fixed mindset. And it was really
Yeah,
amazing to me that you could grab control of that inner experience, and there were ways to do that. So that's really what got me interested in it. I ended up changing my major right then and there. I went to my advisor and she said, well, we're going to have to switch some classes around. You're going to have to take a few
yeah,
extra things so that you can graduate on time. And that was a good lesson in growth mindset right there. But she really supported me in the process, and
yeah.
that's where it changed. Yeah.
Very nice. Yeah, it's funny. I had a similar experience where one experience I went and changed my major pretty quickly after having talked to a sports psychology consultant. He came and talked to our whole athletic department in college, and later on that afternoon, I went and talked to my advisor about switching to psychology. Um, so yeah, that's funny. So you were an athlete. You struggled, with your own mindset and challenges. Um, kind of, I'm curious. This COVID-19, the pandemic that we're going through. Um, what are you seeing in terms of working with your clients? Are you seeing any trends and patterns of challenges that they're facing? You mentioned homeschooling your kids. I know that's one of my bigger stressors, right? What are some of the things that you're seeing, and what are you focusing on with them?
So some trends are managing the stress of it all. I mean, just stress of keeping
Yeah,
yourself healthy and your family healthy. Depending on
right.
individuals, the challenges are unique. Sometimes, like athletes, for example, some of them had their season taken away. People are shifting to working from home in an environment that is not always ideal for working from home. So there's been a lot
Yeah,
of, I guess, managing the stress, having active recovery and what that looks like, and how to still be productive, but also changing your definition of what productive is. I think that is something that I've talked to
yeah,
people a lot about, because most of the folks, as you know, Robert, that we work with, they care about how do I get better? How do I improve? How do I
yeah.
stay on the top of my game? And people still want to do that. So some of what is adjust expectations, and how can you still do that given the conditions that you're in?
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, I'm seeing that quite a bit myself. And the most recent analogy I came up with, I'm curious your thoughts on it. So I was talking to one of my clients. His stress relieving technique is working out, right, and getting super fit, but he's also really busy at work, right? There's just a lot of projects on his plate, and I use the analogy of this is not preseason, right? You're in the playoff run, right? So if you think about an athlete in that kind of environment, they're not
Mhm.
working out as hard as they would in the beginning of the season, right? They're just
Right.
maintaining, um, and that resonated with him to kind of shift that perspective of of what is realistic right now. Um,
Mhm.
what do you think of that? Is that an apropos analogy?
I like it. I like that a lot. Can I
Yeah.
steal it?
Yes, you can for sure,
uh,
for sure.
yeah, no, I really
Yeah,
love
that's
that.
I've seen that a lot. That shifting, right? Like that inability to like this is my goal, and times are different, but I'm not changing my goal based off the new scenario I'm finding myself in. Yeah,
Right. I think something that aligns with what you're talking about is that I've been working on with people is, especially if you know this is you're in playoffs right now. If you use that example, are you
yeah,
taking time to actively recover? Are you taking time to turn off the stress response? Because if you leave it running all the time and you don't deliberately turn it off, that's going to affect your health and your well-being. And that's been
right.
something I think that a lot of people, and I do too, struggle with because we feel like we should be doing all of the things really well, taking care of our family and teaching our
Right.
kids and still doing our jobs well. And recovery is something that is a really important piece to peak performance and performance psychology, whatever you want to call it. That's a really important piece, and
Yeah.
it's a piece I think that's getting left out a little bit.
The recovery piece, yeah. So, what are some of the things you're doing? I know you sent me a great bio of yourself, right? You're a self-described plant lady. You're forced to do workouts, soccer workouts, so your husband can prep for his practices. Um, and you. So, I guess here's the question: in your bio, you talked about you're learning about DC and Marvel.
Oh
Um,
yes.
which one is your which one are you going with? Are you a more DC or more of a Marvel person?
I think it's funny that you have to choose, but I learned that that's a thing too. That you're supposed to. And my
That
my
is a
son
thing. It is a thing.
he broke a rule on his fifth birthday. His birthday's in the summer, and
Yeah.
he wanted a Spider-Man and Batman party. So
Oh
we did that.
wow.
I felt like we were breaking a rule there. Wonder Woman's got to be
Yes,
my
a little bit.
favorite. She's my favorite, so
Yeah.
I gotta go see.
DC. Yeah. 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 No, I'm with you. Yes, there is a big rule about that. But so I bring all that up because I know those are ways that you probably recharge, is spending time with family.
Mm-hmm.
What are some of the things you do to recharge your batteries and particularly during this time?
Yes, so I am a plant lady. I think actually my husband gave me that
Yeah.
name. He might have done that one. I
Yeah.
have a lot of plants
Yeah.
indoors and outdoors. And so
Yeah.
it's hot and warm here in Texas, so we're very fortunate to be able to garden and be outside in my backyard. So picked some tomatoes yesterday. So that's one way. Like so, one I think just the cycle of stress and rest. So it's okay to stress yourself, just like with physical exercise. It's okay to stress yourself from a mental perspective, but you want to put in active recovery. So I try to cycle in my recovery. So if I've worked for a little while, then I need to go and take a break. So right now, because it would be different if my husband and son were both at school. My husband's a teacher and a coach, and my son is normally this was his first year of kindergarten. So
Yeah.
what's different now is we do things together. So he did learn, my son, not my husband, he did learn how to ride his bike
Yeah. Awesome.
during this break. So we've been going on bike rides. We are fortunate to live in a place that allows us to do that. So that's something that we spend a little bit of time doing. Exercise is still important to me, but that looks really different. So I'm spending a little less time exercising, but I'm still making sure that that happens. And then for me, a mindfulness practice is really important. And I kind of break the rule of like do it at the same time every day because
Yeah.
the time that I had doesn't fit anymore. So now it's just I put a reminder on my phone and I don't swipe the reminder until I have done it. So even if it's the end of the day and
Okay.
I'm about to go to bed and I haven't done it yet, then that's when I do it. So those are my big things for recovery right now, and they do look
Yeah.
different than they did before.
What is your preferred like mindfulness practice? Do you have a go-to or do you mix it up?
I do mix it up, and I have a go-to. I try to
Okay.
mix it up
I
to
like it.
expose myself to different things. But what I am on right now is Sam Harris, his app. There's just, and I talk to people about this all the time. Just find something that resonates with you.
Yeah.
Try out different apps. If you prefer sitting quietly alone, whatever it is, find something that, and I know you talk about this, Robert, find something that you'll do. And
Yeah.
there's lots of things I love about Sam Harris's app, but that's the one that keeps me going back to it every single day. Like I want to do it, even if the day gets busy. When I see the reminder, it's not oh gosh, I didn't do that yet. It's oh yes, I need to make time for that.
Right. Yeah. You're excited about it. Yeah. That's awesome. Yeah. I haven't tried that app. I know I've heard a lot about it, but yeah, I'm a big Headspace
Mm.
guy app. When I like, I actually play a game of solitary every day, of
Mm.
free cell solitary. It's my way of focusing, right? It's hard enough that engages me, but simple enough that it doesn't stress me out. But it does take my undivided attention.
Mm-hmm.
And I try to get the little crown. There's a daily challenge every day, so it takes me about 2-3 minutes, and that's a way that I start my day. Um, and it's a mental game, right? And I enjoy it though. But that's my go-to, and then I try to do some more breath work type exercises.
Yeah.
So what are you? Is there anything specifically you're kind of like looking into and learning about that you're trying to just expand yourself and learn more about?
Uh, Always mindfulness. I still don't know. I've received, some training in mindfulness a little bit and practice in it, but it's something I still don't know if I fully know.
Yeah,
so,
yeah,
so that's why I have my go-to, but I like to explore other avenues. So on the personal front, that's a big one for me. I'm also really interested, and I did my dissertation topic on this, on the effect of performance psychology, mental skills type training in the high school arena. What coaches think about that and what effect it can have. And that one's a little, well, it's also a little personal because as a high school athlete, I didn't have access to those tools, and I think it really
yeah.
would have changed a lot, not just about my athletic performance, but about who I was as a sister and a friend, and just interpersonally as well.
Yeah. I actually just came across an article that I'm going to share with you and a bunch of our colleagues, and it was about the um, what's going to be the psychology of sports once the athletes start playing without fans, right? From the referees to the coaches to the players, how will they behave? What is it going to do to them that you know nobody's watching, right? Particularly for professional athletes, but I would say even for high school and collegiate athletes, when we start getting back, and if they're not playing with any fans in front of them, what's that going to do to our psyche and motivation? I don't know if you've spent any time thinking about that, but I'm just off the cuff. Like I thought it was a very interesting perspective to think about in a mental exercise. What do you think of
So,
that?
a, lots of things. And actually, soccer came back on today. My husband is a
Yeah,
soccer coach, so it's the first thing that gets turned on usually in the morning, and it's no fans. And I don't know,
yeah,
we're having discussions about it. I like hearing his perspective as a former player and as a coach. Um,
yeah.
I have all kinds of thoughts. It's like we talk to athletes about how the external doesn't have to have an impact on what's happening internally. However,
Right.
sometimes people can use that as part of their channeling of energy, and it's a tool. It's something that's
Yeah,
there, then you use it as a tool. So I do think
right.
that there will be, differences for people for lots of different reasons. That's why I say I have lots of thoughts about it because, we always say the audience shouldn't matter.
Right.
It shouldn't change how you play. But if you've
Yeah.
learned that it's there and you've learned how to channel that energy, which is a wonderful
Right.
tool, what does that do for you playing? We were watching this morning, my husband and I were like, okay. I mean, also they've been off for, months, not playing, but we were trying
Yeah.
to we figure out what's going on in their heads watching them play right now because they're playing with no. And also the something I didn't think about until we were watching Dortmund this morning. That's my husband's team.
Yeah.
Uh, they're distancing the players themselves, so they're not sitting next to each other. They're 6 feet apart. And I was curious
Right.
about that effect too. Like when you go back to the bench, there's some really cool research about when your team approaches you after something happens on the field, what that does for your confidence and for your the effect that then has on your physiology. And if you don't have that piece, that's a whole other element that it didn't occur to me until I watched this morning.
Yeah, yeah, I didn't think about that either. That's great, and that's one of the reasons that I love talking to you. You're so well versed in the research. You're always able to connect it back to this evidence base. So I think that's awesome, and I appreciate that a lot about our conversations. Um, so, any advice for like if somebody came to you and said, "Hey, I need that crowd, right? I need that to amp me up." And now we're going into this situation. What's some things that you would maybe focus in on them with, in terms of helping them get themselves where they need to be?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. I think first I would say let's acknowledge that you're going to be missing that. Like, let's just not pretend like that's
Yeah,
not a factor. And
yeah,
just, I don't know what that conversation would look like, but let's just be okay with the fact that that is
yeah,
something that you're going to miss, that is not quite going to be the same. And then from
yeah,
there, I always want to, I love going back to some of the basics sometimes, eyes off, when you're in your zone of optimal functioning. And if when a crowd is there, you feel like that is the case, let's turn it inward. What feelings are you having? What is your physiology like? What are some of the things that you might be saying to yourself? And then how can we replicate that with strategies that drive those emotions and drive that physiological response that you're looking for, whether it be imagery or self-talk.
yeah,
Um, there's so many, breathing, actual physical strategies, music, other ways to replicate it. And also, just for me, also knowing that it might not quite be the same, and accepting that, because if you get in those moments and it doesn't quite feel the same, like that could have an interesting effect on your performance. So I think acknowledging that up front, and knowing that you're
yeah,
trying to try to replicate that as much as possible, but it might look different. And if and when it does, what are your strategies to keep you in your zone?
yeah. You mentioned acceptance twice there, right? And I think it goes back to our earlier conversation about mindfulness, right? Like, how do we accept? And it's such a simple thing to say. Yeah, just accept it's going to be different. Accept that, and for not just athletes, but for all of us, right? That things are different than they were um, before. So it's very easy to say, much more difficult to do in practice. But I think some of that mindfulness and just in learning to accept is what
Yeah,
is important. I always talk about accuracy. I want people to be accurate in the way they're thinking, right? Not necessarily positive or negative. I mean, either of those
right.
are appropriate, but regardless, I want accuracy, right?
Mhm.
And so sometimes we try to sugarcoat things, we try to downplay things,
Mhm.
and I think if we're just accurate, then we can. It's easier to accept. Not necessarily, that it'll happen, but I think it is easier. Any other things you from an acceptance practice besides mindfulness, things that strategies, I know, I'm going to throw out some terms that some people may not know watching, but like cognitive reframing strategies to
Mhm.
like shift your focus and your perspective. What are some of
Yeah.
the things that you talk to people about when you are focusing on that acceptance piece?
Yeah. So I always go back to that thought performance relationship. So definitely cognitive
Yeah,
reframing is a huge part of that. There might be physiological strategies like deep breathing, whatever it is that brings you center. Another one that helps me accept, that I've learned through different avenues, is being curious. So like I've always heard that too, like acceptance, acceptance, acceptance. But how do I do it other than noticing or paying attention? And
yeah,
curiosity is something that I talk with people about. Just like, okay, well, when you notice the emotion or thought or whatever it might be curious about it. And it's, as a
yeah,
strategy, it's really interesting what that can do, because you pay attention to what's happening in a different way when you take the approach of curiosity, which is it's a
yeah,
reframing, like you said, it's a reframing technique. But it's one that I like to use and I like to share with others. If you can, and again, cool research about, like, if you pay attention, to an emotion, for example, and you are curious about it, when you shift your attention to that, you can take away the negative valence of it, by changing your perspective of it.
Yeah. Awesome. Yeah. Curiosity. My three watchwords I talk to my clients about is curiosity, accuracy, and clarity. Right.
Love it.
That's how I'm always so yeah. Curious is the first place. Right. That's how we're going to figure out what is going on right with ourselves, why we're feeling a certain way, why we're thinking certain things, why our actions were such, but also about others. We worked with Dr. Karen Rivich, and I don't know if I heard it from her, but first, but I heard it definitely from her, like leaning in to
Yes.
discomfort or leaning into, she talked about it in a slightly different context of like when you're training and somebody asks you that hard question, instead of like shying away from it, like lean into it. And I've applied that to also leaning into our emotions, good or bad, right? Just or negative or positive, just leaning into that by asking yourself questions instead of like, nope, let me compartmentalize that, put that over here. How do I like, let me be more curious about what's going on? And
Right.
I that's the one of my strategies of like, just lean into it. If it's uncomfortable, that's where you want to go.
Right. I heard that from Dr.
Yeah,
Rivich too. And you hear athletes say that,
yeah,
be comfortable with the uncomfortable. I also,
yeah, yeah,
I'm glad you said that, because that reminded me. I also talk to people about, in the moment strategies and then practices. There's a mindfulness practice you can have over time. But you can also get yourself more comfortable with discomfort. And I don't want to, like, cross
right,
lines of what gets into the realm of, psychology, but from a performance perspective, if there's an emotion that I'm not comfortable with, well, what's something you can do that triggers that emotion? Is it making a phone call to someone
right.
that you don't want to make? Is it asking, which things are different right now for this scenario, but a scenario I would use sometimes is asking where something is in the store from an employee. Like, does that make you uncomfortable? As a
Right.
practice, do things, throughout your day, or throughout your week, that give you practice at being uncomfortable.
Yes. Yeah, yeah. Really learning to just that it's okay, right? That we're going to counter these things all the time. Um, I here I want to. This is, I think you'll relate to this story, but it just reminded me of this. Is I went to a college principal at my kid's school, and they talked about a lot of different things, policies, but they also then got into anti-bullying conversations, which I appreciate. I think it's important to try to prevent bullying. But I
Mm-hmm.
raised my hand and be doing what we do, and I was like, so what are we teaching our kids on how to deal with a bully, right? Because that we're going to face that. Some of the work we're doing, I was actually looking up research on values and values impact on bullying and values. And you know what I found was not on kids about bullying. It was really about workplace bullying. Like, when you type in values and bullying in Google Scholar, you're going to come up with a ton of workplace stuff. So
Mm-hmm.
it reminds me of just like learning to deal with the uncomfortable, and how do you deal in this case with people, right? But it could also be with circumstances that just kind of made me think of that as you were talking about that, learning, putting yourself in uncomfortable situations. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so kind of switching, you've been giving me some good insight into like what are some of the things you do, for yourself. Are there any things that you are don't do what I, don't do as I say, not as I do, as it relates to mental skills? Are there any like things that you're like, the research on it, that it has value, you've seen clients use it, but for whatever reason, like that's one of your sticking points. Are there any of those for yourself?
All of them at times. Just like being
Yeah,
human, it's hard. I
yeah,
learned recently about the term, GI Joe fallacy, like with specific to biases, but just knowing it's not is half the battle is not true at all. Um, but one in specific that I actually maybe just last week have tried to start practicing more. So one that I always recommend, but don't do as often for myself because I'm not good at it, is imagery. When I sit down to image things, I have a really difficult time creating the images. So instead of putting in the work, like I tell people to do, to enhance how how vivid I can make an image and how much I can control it. I struggle with the controlling piece of imagery a lot. Uh, so just last week, I started adding a little bit of that at the end of my mindfulness practice, but that is one I know the science, and I know so many
Right.
people who use it effectively, and I think it's because it's the hardest for me. I'm not. It's not my go-to.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's great. I love it. Yeah. We all have them, right? Where we're teaching it. Maybe we're having a whole lesson on it, and we're just like, I barely do this, or I hate this lesson, or what have you, right? So, so no, I appreciate the candor and leaning into that, right? On the other end of the spectrum, I think you maybe answered this, but what are some of the things that you think you do really well that have helped you be mentally tough and persevere in challenging situations?
Mm, man, you flip the question. It's always harder to say what you do well than what you could improve.
Yeah.
Uh, I think it's a newer one for me. It wasn't always this way, but because I have been curious about mindfulness, I've gotten much better um, at being present. So that's like a huge piece to being
Yeah.
able to have control over the thought performance connection. Being able to be self-aware. I think you have to be present, too, to even pay attention to those things. And I've gotten a lot better than that. I don't always make the right choices in the moment because overreacting for whatever reason might feel better in that moment, or saying whatever it might be. But
Right.
I'm a lot better at noticing and noticing afterwards. So that's more of a reflective piece. But to me, that's part of mindfulness too. So like noticing in the moment, but maybe even like afterwards, noticing what happened.
Yeah. That's awesome. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, 'cause I think that's helpful. You had asked me earlier before we got started, like what prompted me to do these broadcasts, these live sessions, and it's I have all these great conversations with people like with other colleagues, and we talk about such great things. You and I almost on a weekly basis are meeting as a group, right, with other colleagues to talk about different curriculum and trainings we're going to be working on, and there's such great, rich discussions that I wanted to capture some of that, and I think sometimes. That's the best way for people to learn, right? So I wanted to put out this information so that way, for example, what you just described, like the things that you struggle with or the things that you're doing well, other people can learn from, right? And so I think it's important. We're human. We don't do everything as well as we'd like, right? Even though we know the science and we know the research, uh, but we're not always applying it. And
Mm-hmm.
so that's the goal, right? That's a constant battle of growth and development is and that lifelong learning kind of mindset. So that's where
Yeah.
this started, and like what you're giving us is great because I think it's going to be really helpful to people so they can see what they can do, and then particularly with you adding some of that research, I think is awesome. I was looking down at your bio as we are talking here, and I want to talk a little bit about the dissertation or your doctorate in transformational leadership. Right, we're going through a transformation right now, right, in the world, right, from companies to sports organizations. What are some of the things that are maybe similar to the performance psychology, but maybe more on that leadership side that you've learned or that you've also been applying to some of your work with your clients?
Mm. Oh, so many things. It took me a long time to decide kind of what area I wanted to learn more about, and I was so happy when
Yeah.
I landed on. I finally just you. I could have debated about it forever, and I was like, okay, I just need to make a decision at some
Right.
point.
Right.
And
Right.
I one thing, and it relates to similar to some of what we learned in resilience training. Robert, you and I have done that with the military. Was meaning perspectives and how So the term I learned in transformational leadership is meaning perspectives, and how
Right.
your the way that you see your worldviews, basically. The way that you see the world really filters everything. And
Yeah.
that just has, I think, just talking to people about that, like, well, what are your worldviews that your self-talk is filtering through, that your just your perceptions about what's happening around you is filtering through, and just having an
Yeah.
awareness of what that is and what those are is such a great additional tool, because we can talk about
Right.
self-talk strategies, and we can talk about changing perspective, and that's all really important. And some But if it's being filtered through something you're not aware of, um, you're not getting the full bang for your buck.
Yeah. That's such a great point. I that values piece, that knowing what matters to you, colors everything that we're doing, right? And you see all these companies, the military that we work with has creeds and mottos and mission statements and vision statements, but many people, particularly in organizations, right, they're maybe not even aware of what the company's values or mission statements are, let
Mm-hmm.
alone how they can live those and use and leverage those to
Yeah,
improve
leverage.
their self-talk, to improve team dynamics, what have you. Um, how do you help people or organizations or individuals for themselves, like, figure some of that stuff out? Like, what are some of the tools you use, the resources you use?
uh, One, I guess it's a tool, is just asking questions. So
Yeah.
in my work, I do a lot of one-on-one. I feel very fortunate to be able to do that, to be one-on-one with people, because
Right.
so that's my
Yeah.
tool, maybe because I do things more one-on-one. So I can just ask some questions, and when you tune your, I tune my ear to, like, what could be a meaning perspective or a worldview that's coming into play here, and just asking some questions about it. There are ways that people can do that for themselves, and just ask themselves a question, like, what might be driving this? Like, where might this be coming from? It goes back to the curiosity. So curiosity would be a tool, like, maybe curious about this. Um,
Yeah.
Outside of that, I don't have too many other things. That seems to be what I go to all the time, to teach to others, and for me to use, with other people.
Yeah. So you mentioned, like, what, so people can write, some of these things down. So what drives
Mm-hmm.
you, being curious, leaning into, like, certain reactions, or thoughts
Mm-hmm.
that they're having? Um, is this
Oh,
something
I
you
think
would recommend people writing down the answers to these questions? And then what would they do once they answer them?
I, I would. I just, when you get things down on paper, it's different than when it's in your head. To me,
Yeah.
when you see things written down, and it's reflected in front of you, it does something different. And I actually did think of another strategy I usually have people do, and this looks 100 different ways. Something about writing
Yeah.
down, like, your personal philosophy. So that can be answering questions. There's so many different ways to do that with athletes. Sometimes,
Yeah.
you'll do, like, if you were at a banquet at the end of the year, and you got to choose someone to say things about you, what would you want them to say? Usually that's
Yeah.
reflects what's important to them. So there's so
Yeah.
many different ways to do that. Um, I Something I do for myself and I do with others is, once you've answered the questions, this is more of like a strategy. Get
Yeah.
it into a sentence, like, get it into a sentence and put it places. Just so it's in your, in your awareness. And it can also work as, something we talk about a lot in, performance psychology, is a primer. When you sit down to do your work, or you
Yeah.
go into the gym to do your work, or you go onto the field, wherever your work lies, putting it somewhere. So that would be the purpose of making it, something short and simple that reminds you of the bigger picture, so that it can be a
Right.
primer and a reminder.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that. Yeah, I was talking to Justin Sua, who a
Mm-hmm.
pretty, prominent, sports psychology consultant that we both know, and we did a video chat, and he was asking us how we get at, values exploration. We talked about via character strengths, um, and then, that was kind of the big one, and he was asking for beyond that. And I think some of these questions get at some of that, right? Like I love that banquet question, right? It's like, maybe a more morbid one is like the tombstone. Like, what would you want written on your tombstone, your
Yeah,
epitaph?
right.
Or what, uh, you know, what do you want your legacy to be? All those kinds of questions. Do you have other ways of like kind of digging deeper and exploring values or other strategies? Even though they might be uh, pretty simple in what they are, but how they bear the fruit, I think, is important.
There, I learned this one from Dr. Ravitch actually, like looking to stories that resonate with you, and that's why the VIA got
Yeah,
created. They looked
yeah,
to influential things within people's communities. So that's one.
yeah,
Uh, just playing around with the different types of questions. Sometimes, what are your favorite quotes? Write all those down, and why are those important? There's Dr. Michael Gervais has a couple of questions for professional philosophy that I love. I think that's one of his. Is like write down the quotes that resonate with you, and then once you do, so this is another valuable piece of writing it down. Like once you do, then kind of choose, like narrow, pick the words that stand out and circle 10 of them. Oh, Kelly McGonigal has an exercise similar to that. Like uh, write those down, and then so a little bit different. So there's answering questions, and then another one would be once you pick the words, then just free write about it. And I've done this with high school athletes, and it's amazing. So I'll give
yeah.
them a list of values, and this comes from Kelly McGonigal's work, and have them circle, and they narrow it down to one. And I'm like, okay, just write about it for 10 minutes, whatever you want. And they will stare at me for a minute, like, what do you want me to write? I'm like, I don't know, anything that comes to mind related to that value, why it's important to you, why you picked it, anything. And so
Right.
there'll be a little bit of ruffling in the beginning and then silence for 10 minutes. And it's such a simple
Yeah,
thing, just write about it. Like, that's it.
yeah,
And I've
yeah,
seen high
yeah.
school kids do that, and just spending that time. I mean, I love the VIA, and I love, you know, value, like looking to list of values and things like that. But I also think there's something really valuable just to do anything that moves you inward, whether it's my favorite quotes, my favorite books, or just why did I pick this? Like
Yeah,
deep
yeah.
into it a little bit.
Yeah, music is one, right? Like think about the songs you like and the songs that resonate with you, right? We know music has a big impact on us emotionally. Obviously athletes use it a lot, from that priming perspective. But yeah, because it elicits an emotional response, right? And so I think, yeah, I like music as an exploratory tool as well. That's
Mm-hmm.
awesome. That it gives us me some additional tools, but hopefully everybody watching as well.
Yeah.
Um, I want to. I'm always curious what people's philosophy and how they explain what we do, right? To clients. I gave you kind of my like watchwords, right? Curiosity, accuracy, clarity, right? Like those are big fundamental pieces. So, and I use that kind of at the beginning of a lot of my conversations. Um, I was just curious, like, are there things like that that you have to get out to, when you're working with clients at the beginning of your conversations, or they at least come up pretty, in the early stages of working with somebody, and how do
Yeah.
you explain performance psychology?
Well, I don't know if I do it well,
Yeah,
but that is usually when I, work with people. Sometimes they don't really know what performance psychology is, and they're just interested.
right.
They're curious, like, okay, what is
Yeah,
this?
yeah,
So the way I usually explain it is that there are habits and like daily regular habits, and then strategies that you can engage in that help you be your personal best. So that's going to look different than anyone else's personal best. And there are approaches that we take to whatever our craft is, whether it's sport or work or
right,
parenting, whatever it might be. If you can de- be deliberate in your craft, and if you can take time for recovery to manage your mental muscle. I talk a lot about, think of the brain as if it's a muscle. You have to exercise it with practices. You have to let it recover. You have to have rejuvenation
right,
the same way you would with your muscles and your actual muscles. treat your brain that way,
Right.
and then also be clearly defined on your purpose. This is if you take a deliberate approach, if you manage your stress and your recovery strategies, and treat your brain like a muscle, and if you have a clearly defined purpose into everything that you do, then that's a big part of performance psychology, and that applies not just to sport or the military or work. It applies to anything that is your craft, and it'll just I find that it makes me my personal best in any of those situations. And then within those domains, what are the habits and what are the strategies? And those are the things that we've learned through research work, like imagery and pre-performance routines and setting intentions. Those are the things we know help, and they're really helping you to manage those domains.
Yeah. You brought up a couple of areas that you work with people on, and maybe it's not even you working with them, but that they bring up as goals of theirs or areas they want to improve. The ones that aren't the infinite ones like parenting or leadership that are like this broad category of performances, right? And we get that all the time, right? In the areas we work with, I want to be the best, parent. I want to be the best salesperson, right? And sales might have a little more of a metric to it, but parenting does it, right? I mean, our kids may give us that mug that says we're the best mom or dad, right? Or the T-shirt, but how do we know if we've achieved that? Or and when somebody gives you kind of that goal of theirs, how do you help? I think you kind of answered it, but help me understand like what's your process for that.
Yeah. So shifting, I think, more away from in state and outcome, which is a little bit different than
Yeah,
how I first started in performance psychology. In states and outcomes are important,
yeah,
but like you said, for a lot of these domains, we don't really know what that looks like. And if you're talking about like a true path to mastery, there is no end state. It's just
right.
it's constant, and there's ups and there's downs. And so this is where I think being present is really important, and being curious, and just and I say these to people, and I'm like, I know this sounds weird, but how does it feel? If it feels
Yeah,
right, if it feels good, like that, it's not a metric that we can. I mean,
yeah,
maybe there are ways to figure that out, but I'm not using them right now. Uh,
yeah,
but focusing more on that, like what's your feedback in the moment, what's happening in the moment,
right.
and I guess that's something we learned from athletes, that and the military too. Like, they have these feedback systems. How can you apply that to your own moment to moment, just what's happening in the moment? So, like, if I take homeschooling or crisis schooling, really,
Right.
in the moment, like
Right.
if I'm there in that moment, I can create my own feedback systems. Like, what is his body language like?
Right.
What is my body language like this? And what my child does is not always reflective of what I'm doing. Hopefully,
Right.
they're
For
their
sure.
own person
Yeah.
too. So I don't think there's like a concrete answer, but from me anyway. But like, getting away from the outcome in the end state, and more like present moment, and what are my feedback systems in the moment.
Yeah. That's awesome. Do you ever ask your kids how you're doing, either at teaching your son, like about, or even as a parent? Do you ever like, are you ever curious, and do you ever get good responses?
I'm always very curious, and I
Yeah.
sometimes not.
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
Sometimes my
Yeah.
feedback system
Oh,
is eye rolling and
right. Yeah.
frustration,
Yeah. Yeah.
and just like in other areas, you have to take that feedback, and just it's information. It's not good or bad or indifferent. Like,
Right.
what's the information, and it may or may not be something I'm doing. But yeah, that's a funny question. I think he says yes mostly so that he doesn't have to go to school. I think he thinks if he says yes, he gets
Right.
to
Right.
stay
Yeah.
home on bike rides at lunchtime every day.
Right. Yeah. 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 I'll ask both of my daughters, how I'm doing as a dad, and the responses are funny. They're like, "Yeah, you're pretty good." And I'm like, "Okay." They say I get intense sometimes, because when they say they have a goal, I get full. performance psychology consultant on them. We take out a
Oh,
piece of paper, we start writing out the goals, right? And they're like, "Whoa, whoa! I just said I like singing," So
you'll love this story then,
yeah,
Robert. My son, he's also the youngest in his class, so he tends to be a little
yeah,
bit more behind developmentally, and he's very comparative. So he notices that his friends, and we've tried to tell him like your friends are a full year older than you. They're going to be able to do
yeah.
things differently than you are. Um, but he was working on something and he was struggling, and I was like, "But you know what happens when you struggle when something is hard?" And he goes, I know, my brain grows." Got it. Like, stop sports
Yes.
psychology meeting.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. That's funny. Yeah, my youngest, my 5-year-old, she'll meditate, but she'll do it in a very mocking and sarcastic way. I don't know. That might be as a new strategy is sarcastic breath work.
Yeah, when I
And
have my son,
so
he's also 5. When I have him meditate, he'll give some type of stipulation. He's like, "All right, but I'm not closing my eyes." He wants some kind of
yeah,
control over it.
yeah, yeah, for sure. So we're it's already been 45 minutes.
Oh,
So I know, yeah, it goes by quick. I did want to ask you a little bit about like maybe some strategies that you think would be. I know you've talked about a ton already, but ones that would be helpful for people in broad that you want people to do. Like I always say, if I get people to do one thing, it'd be some type of breath work, right? Or
mm-hmm.
quieting of the mind on a regular basis. Is there something like that, and maybe it's even that one that you
Yeah.
would want everybody to from a sport and performance psychology perspective to implement into their day-to-day lives?
That is one huge. If I can tell anyone to do anything, it would be breath work and or some type of mindfulness practice. And that's
Right.
one, we know the science, and also I've felt the personal benefits to that. I think
Yeah.
that's huge. Something that it's that Viktor Frankl quote, like between stimulus and response, there's space. And I feel like breath work and mindfulness helps you create that space, makes that
Yeah.
space bigger. And then again, I don't know if it's necessarily a strategy, but I always encourage people to be curious about your thoughts, be curious about your emotions, be curious about your reactions. Like, and that can
Yeah.
be it can almost be a cue word. So maybe that's the strategy. Is like, be curious.
Right. Yeah, no, I think that the art of self-reflection or reflection in general, because of we're in this go 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 world, right? So not taking some time to slow down and to think about why things happen. I think that's a great strategy. What is it about people that like they don't, from your perspective, that they don't want to be curious, they don't want to self-reflect? What are some of the excuses or reasons maybe people give you for not wanting to do that?
Um, uh, let's see. I guess hmm, being a judge of what they find. So they'll
Yeah,
have all their reasons for you know the reasons are all over the place, but the way that I would blanket
right.
that is like being a judge of what
Yeah,
we see when we write down what we're really thinking and how we're really
right.
feeling. And you don't we're human, they are what they are. Like, don't be a judge of it. Be curious about
Yeah.
it.
So yeah, self
Actually,
judgment. Yeah.
yeah, Mark Breckett, he wrote Permission to Feel, and he has that the ruler method. He's fantastic. Definitely read his book. But he uses the
Yeah.
term be an emotion scientist, not an emotion judge. And I think that applies to
Right.
everything. Like, be a thought
Yeah.
scientist, not a
I
thought
love that.
judge. Be a well, this would be a physiologist, but not a
Yeah.
physiology judge. We judge so much about what's happening internally, and if you put that aside and become a scientist of it, then that is different.
Yeah. Yeah. So that self critique, self judgment. The other thing I find is, and maybe I don't know if you see it, is some people are afraid of what it looks like to reflect, right? Meaning, like if you're at work and you're in your office and reflection just looks sitting there quietly, maybe, right? Or sitting there writing, right? And so, particularly if it's just in the cognitive realm, right? And you're just thinking, it doesn't look like you're doing anything, right? And so
Yes.
people have from what I've seen is people have a fear of whenever somebody walks in and catches me like what looks like daydreaming, right? When you're actually
Yes.
doing some really hard work, right? And that's
I
the other
love
one
it.
is that it's also
Yeah.
mentally taxing, right? To do some really
Mhm.
deep diving and some of that being a scientist in terms of what you're thinking. Sorry, you were going to say something.
No, I'm just so glad you said that because that applies to
Yeah.
so many things that I work with people is um, what is defined as like peak performance and productive and deep work, whatever that is not it's not taking breaks, it's not meditating, it's not
Right.
self-reflecting. So yeah, I'm so glad you said that because I do talk with people about like I have to sometimes tell people it is a peak performance strategy to take an active recovery break in your workday.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah, yeah. It has to be part of that process for sure. That's awesome, Arlene. This has been a enlightening. I've taken a bunch of notes for things for myself, right? That I want to go back and read in terms of books and follow up on some of that research. But I really appreciate you taking some time on today and talking to us. I know you got get to your plants and figure out
yeah,
which DC movie you're going to watch next. But I really appreciate you spending some time with us and sharing. Also, a shout out to Dewey and Kim from EKH Media for putting this together. Thank you so much. But yeah, any parting words that you have for our audience?
thank you for listening. Thank you, Robert, for having me on,
Yeah.
and thank
And
you.
where can people find you, Arlene? Tell us where,
Oh,
if people wanted to reach out, where are some spaces that they can find and learn a little bit more about you?
I'm active on LinkedIn and Twitter, so I connect with people all the time on mostly LinkedIn. I don't know if I just get those alerts more frequently, but if I get the
Yeah, yeah,
messages on there,
yeah.
I tend to respond on there pretty quickly.
Okay. And Twitter as well are the
Yes,
two spaces. All
yes.
right. So reach out if you have any questions. Arlene's a great sports psychology practitioner, and I appreciate you spending some time with us here today. Have a great day.
You too.
Thanks, Arlene. Bye.